Welcome, everyone. Hello, and welcome to our first ever Ask a Viking live stream on the Bjorn Paints channel. It's been about 8 months since I did any live streams at all, so we've been having some technical issues, but hopefully um, everything is working well now. Hey, thank you, Flame, for following the channel. I really appreciate that. Yeah, and hopefully, if this ends up being really popular, thank you, Dos, also for following. That if this becomes, everybody likes this stream, then maybe we'll make this into like a weekly thing, if possible. But yeah, so we're going to discuss kind of the basics of the Norse mythology and culture today. So as many of you know, I am a Gothi, which is like a priest in the Old Norse religion, the pre-Christian religion, and as such, it is my responsibility to have accurate information and to accurately represent the culture to people who are interested. I've taken an oath to do so, and oaths are the most powerful of rites within Norse culture. So I wanted to say I'm even compelled to do so. And since everybody seems so interested in learning more and having an open dialogue, I decided that we'd have kind of a Q&A going on here. So what I'd like to do is kind of start about talking about who the Nordic people are, and from there we can talk about answer questions, talk about how we know what we know about the Norse culture and Norse mythology, and yeah, it should be pretty fun. So I'm going to wish I was better prepared. But you know, I'm going to pull up a map here of the Germanic tribes. My computer's being laggy, but this is the first time I've been live on my computer. Before I was just live on my Xbox, so it's a little bit different. Okay, if I can. All right, so so what we have here is kind of a map of Europe back during the Bronze Age. So this is kind of when we really first start hearing about the Romans start talking about the Germanic tribes and the Germanic peoples. Here you can see we have the southern part of Scandinavia here. This is Denmark at the top here, and then this is going to be Sweden, and then we have Norway above that, and so those are kind of your main Scandinavian countries that are kind of the heart of the Nordic culture. Nordic meaning it involves the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, as well as Finland and Iceland. But Iceland doesn't get settled till way later. So right now you kind of have this culture start to develop in Denmark, where everything kind of starts. And as this kind of Proto-Germanic culture starts to spread out, they create different family tribes as they go. You kind of have your Utes, you have your Angles, you have your Vandals. They kind of create this whole area which is known as Greater Germany, and from there you create what is kind of the basis of all the Germanic cultures, and the Angles are actually the ones that go to England, and which is why it's called England, or the land of the Angles. So they were actually a Germanic culture as well. So what we're talking about here is kind of the mythology that is the basis of pre-Christian belief for the Angles, the Anglo-Saxons, the Germans, and which they have their own language variances over time. But the ones that survived the best were the ones that were recorded in Iceland right after the Viking Age, and these are the ones from Scandinavia. So, and being of Scandinavian descent myself, these are the names that I'm going to be using and talking about, and probably the ones that most people are familiar with because of their interactions with Marvel and the Thor characters. So you should be able to recognize a lot of these terms. So out of the about so you have kind of the invasion of Christianity into and converting the Germanic and Celtic tribes, and when this happens, you have Emperor Charlemagne send the Saxons over to kind of, and it kind of makes it so that it creates this culture in England, which they call the Anglo-Saxon culture. And it was only about 90 years before the beginning of the Viking Age, which started in 775 with the raid of Lindisfarne, that you Autumn is here. Good to thank you for following. It's really good to see you. Yeah, we so after the about 90 years before the beginning of the Viking Age, you have the over in England, you have the Angles converting to Christianity and such. Before that, so clear from the Bronze Age up until that time, you have cultural trade between the Celts, and then of course across all the different sister cultures of the Germanic tribes. So you have a long time exchange of art and history and ideas and roots and stuff, and that only kind of gets disrupted when they convert to Christianity, and they no longer decide to start trading with the pagans anymore. And so what happens was you have this kind of language change in about the year 500 up in Scandinavia, because there was this great volcano that went off in Iceland and kind of caused this long, 3-year winter where there's no real summer. They said that the sun is only as bright as the moon because of all the smoke and the ash in the sky, and it really devastates and wipes out 75% of the population in Scandinavia. And as they're trying to rebuild their society and such, they need to start gathering resources because they don't have any of these crops or stuff anymore. And so they start exploring out into these other lands, these people that are no longer in frith with them, which is a peaceful contract within a community. If you're of a different culture, a different religion, you're then not following the same laws. And so without those laws, it's no longer illegal to murder or steal from you, which is kind of the basis of the Viking raids that start happening. To start gathering resources for their families, they can kill people who aren't part of their culture, their community. And they think every culture's responsibility to protect their own people. But the vast majority of the people actually don't go Viking raiding. They actually just kind of stay within Scandinavia and just start building up farmsteads, and it's a lot of work because you have to rebuild your farmstead every 30 years or so, because you'll cut down all the trees for a town and area and grow your crops, and then once you've used up that area, you move your entire village over and let that area that you were in start to regrow and replenish, and you move into a big circle so that by the time you come back, the forest and everything's been replenished. And a big reason why the reason that the Scandinavians were so isolated from everybody else was because in the bottom of Denmark, you have this very marshy area between it and Germany, and that's actually what Denmark means, is the land of the marshes. And you have these really heavy forested areas that even the Romans couldn't get through, and they didn't clear out these forests until after they converted to Christianity and stopped living in that kind of semi-nomadic culture, which allowed that sustainability. But even nowadays in Scandinavia, sustainability is a very important aspect of their culture, where they build homes and such with the idea that after the homes get destroyed, that the land will be able to return back to its original state. So they don't put in like super permanent like foundations and such. They let the homes be able to be completely removed, which I find like highly admirable. So that's kind of like who the Nordic people are. A lot of people confuse the Norse with the Celts. The Celts are actually the indigenous people over in England, in the island of Britannia there. The cultures that would rise up and become the Irish, the Scottish, the Welsh. Those are your Celtic cultures, and they use an art style with a lot of knotwork and such, and the Norse do the same thing because of that, like I mentioned, that cultural exchange and trading that happened for 1,000 years before the Viking Age. You had that cultural exchange, and so you had very similar art styles kind of growing up into this western part of Europe. But they are very distinct. I mean, the Celts have their own basis of language, the Gaelic languages, as opposed to the Germanic languages. They have their own gods, their own mythologies and stories and such. So really, it's not fair to lump them together as being exactly the same, even though they share a lot of similarities, being close neighbors. Saying that the Celts and the Norse are the same is kind of like saying the Japanese and the Chinese are the same. When there's a long history of clashes between the two cultures, it's very insensitive to do that. So after you have the Nordic people up here in Scandinavia, and so that's kind of who the Norse are, and how we know what we know about them. So the Celtic and Norse cultures were very what's it called? Oral traditions. They didn't really write many things down. They had writing systems, but these weren't widespreadly used by people. Just the upper classes had the time to learn the writing systems, and so your everyday people couldn't, and then just passed on stories through oral traditions, especially during the long winters. What we know was passed down through many generations of oral tradition up until after the conversion to Christianity in Iceland. Christianity and paganism kind of lived together for a long time, and after the full conversion in the late 1000 AD, you have this idea of that kind of Scandinavian-ness of the culture starts to go away as it gets more and more influenced by mainland Europe. And you kind of get this counter movement in Iceland of trying to retain that kind of Iceland-ness, that Scandinavian-ness, and not be wiped up into the whole Roman-ness and the whole like romanticizations of the Greeks and everything going on there. And so you have this poet, Snorri Sturluson, who gathers a whole bunch of manuscripts that people had written down of different myths, and compiles it together into what's known as the Poetic Edda. So he didn't write this himself. He gathered this and then maybe even transcribed it from other sources, people who were telling him stories. But obviously they were written by many different people. Some of them have linguistic connections that ended in like the year 900. So we know that these stories some of them come directly from the Viking Age, and weren't like reinterpreted afterwards because they maintained that archaic language that they didn't use by the late 1000. So we know this is a really good source for these stories. And after he was done compiling all these different manuscripts together in the Codex Regius, or the Book of the Kings, which is now known as the Poetic Edda, after he compiles it, then he writes his own version of the books, which he calls the Prose Edda, or which we call the Prose Edda, which is his own telling of some of the stories that weren't in there, and kind of his way of introducing to the public these stories without being convicted of heresy. So he has this kind of little like prologue to it about how the gods were actually just people who were great kings, and then eventually they got worshipped over time and were thought of as gods, as kind of a way to dismiss that divinity and not to be in conflict with the philosophies of the church, which would make them like heretical. So your pure sources of information are going to be coming from the Poetic Edda. The one, my favorite translation comes from Dr. Jackson Crawford. It's a very new translation, and he is very knowledgeable about the language and the culture of the Norse people, and so he's very able to translate and accurately depict those ideas and language into a modern English, so it's most easy to understand and read. After Jackson Crawford's translation of the Poetic Edda, I also recommend the Holland translation, because it has a more direct translation, so it uses more archaic language. It's a little bit harder to understand, but once you already know the stories, it's really easy to kind of see the nuances from the words that they chose, because it's a more word-for-word translation. So that's the way I would start if you were interested in learning about these stories. Is I'd start with the Poetic Edda by Dr. Jackson Crawford, and then I would read the Holland Poetic Edda after that, and then there's the Prose Edda, which is this book here, and there's the Everyman version is the version I have that is also pretty easy to read, but it's obviously not as new as Jackson Crawford, so it still uses some more archaic language, but I still find it pretty easy to understand the meanings behind it. And so that's where we really know what the stories come from. Yeah, we've got MJ and we got up to 9 viewers now. Great. We're starting a class here. Everybody following with me so far? Anybody got any questions about anything? But yeah, just kind of, I'll check in every once in a while, make sure that nobody has any questions about anything, and definitely ask questions as we go, if you need like a clarification on anything, for sure. So just moving on to a couple more of the sources that we have. I know this was something that TechSmith was very interested in, is knowing how we know what we know, and a lot of it does come from Snorri, and he wrote the Poetic Edda, the Prose Edda. He wrote the Heimskringla, which is the history of the kings of Norway. Again, I recommend the Liam Hollander translation of that, because he does the most direct and literal translations, which helps you get more of the nuances, even if it does focus more on with more archaic language. And this has a lot of history of the kings and stuff, but it also has a lot of establishment of those genealogical lines through the gods, and it has a lot of context and stuff around the gods and their place leading up to that. So the beginning of that is really good for the mythology as well. We do have a lot of cultural understanding that comes from just the sagas, which are the stories of the kings and the people themselves, not just necessarily the mythology. But we have like the Icelandic sagas that talk about the history of Iceland and its formation and the stuff and the heroes that happened there. a lot of the history going on with like Harald Finehair trying to unify Norway and all those wars and stuff going on, and a lot of the laws and things. We have the Gragas, or the Grey Goose laws, which are literally the laws written down from the Viking Age, where everybody would gather at the Althing every year, which was a legal community gathering, and they would have the law speaker who would read the laws aloud to everyone, so that everybody in the population knew all of the laws, and they would read. They had this transcript that they wrote down after they converted to Christianity to have these laws translate over from the pagan days to the Christian days, and so we have that, which allows us a lot of insight into what was acceptable and not acceptable in Norse society and their way of doing things. Laws are really good that way because it's a contract between society on acceptable behavior, you know. Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, let's see, the questions going on? No. Are there any written down anywhere in particular still? Any witch written down? I do have a Norse shanty. People are calling it a shanty now, but it actually was a poem from the Egil saga. He wrote it when he was like 8 years old, and it was the story goes that he was playing with some other kids and they were being just real shits to him, and they stole his ball, and he got mad, and so he plants an axe through the middle of the head of another kid, and his dad freaks out and is like, no, you're disturbing the peace, well, what are we gonna do? But his mom was like, you're a strong kid, you should be a Viking someday. And so Egil writes down this poem as an 8-year-old, about how his mom thinks he should be a Viking, and his kind of future. And this poem was then translated into a song, and there's kind of an old 1930s version that's been going around, but I did my own translation to kind of more accurately reflect the literal poem itself, which I'm kind of proud of. It was let's see, it kind of goes like this. You might have heard it's the "My Mother Told Me" song that's been really popular, but it goes, "My mother told me one day I would buy a galley with good oars, in Viking distant shores. Standing on the prow, this noble ship I sail, set a course for harbor, then commenced the slaughter." And yeah, so that's the poem, and what's now a sea shanty, and very popular amongst a lot of the Norse reenactors and community nowadays. Yeah, so yes. I do love the Viking metal, and there's a lot of really great renditions of that song. Again, the words that I chose specifically were twisted a little bit to be more of an accurate modern English translation, as opposed to the 1930s English translation. But yeah, there are laws recorded. Again, they're in the books called the Gragas, or the Grey Goose laws, in Iceland. And there's even the Codex Runicus, which is a full manuscript that is written all in medieval runes. That is also just a list of laws for the early 11th century. And so those I highly recommend reading, because again, that gives you a lot of insight into Norse culture, knowing things like how progressive the rights of women's were compared to the rest of European society, where back in those days women were treated more like or property and had no right to vote or get divorced or own land, when in fact they could do all those things in the Norse cultures, which a lot of other people, you can go to outside sources and also read about their thoughts on the Germanic cultures, because the things they think are absurd also give you kind of insight, because a lot of the rest of Europe was talking about how the Norse were so weird that way, or they thought that the Norse were super effeminate because they were so clean. They would actually wash themselves every like Saturday, and they thought that was, and they'd comb and braid their hair, and they were like, oh, that's super effeminate, why would you do that? But you know, that allows us to know that the cleanliness was a very important thing for the Norse, and that they had longer hair that they liked to braid. Even the Romans, back to the Germanic tribes, would comment on how barbaric the tribes were, because if their king was too stingy and wasn't bringing about wealth to everybody underneath him, if his luck wasn't great, and if he was just kind of hoarding, the people would rise up against him and they'd kill him and they'd instill a new king, you know. And to the very nationalistic, very Romans, you know, the idea of rising up against your authority figure like that was absurd. That was barbaric to them. To us, that's like, oh, it's a great version of democracy there. Maybe not killing, but you know, the power still lies within the people, you know. And yeah, I mean, the rest of Europe back during the Viking Age, they only washed themselves like maybe once like a month or once a year even. So to wash yourselves every week, they thought was absurd, because to them, in their great medicine, they thought that if you washed yourself more, you wouldn't have that protective layer of dirt, and you'd get sick more, which was a very backwards way to look at things, and a lot of it doesn't even smell. It smells like person, not shit. What kind of civilization is this? But yeah, I mean, so the Norse, and they'd wash themselves with a very strong like soap, which was made from lye, and the lye would actually bleach their hair and their beards as they washed every Saturday, which would give the impression that all Scandinavians were super blonde, and gave the Norse culture the idea that the upper class, the ones who could wash themselves more, had blonder hair and than the lower class in Norse society. And when really it was just the bleaching that was going on from their soap. The Romans, even back in the Germanic tribes in the Bronze Age, were talking about, or the early Iron Age, talking about the Germanic tribes, how they had the hair the same color and consistency of wheat or horse hair, because of it being bleached out and getting that kind of dry crispiness, because they didn't really have good conditioning back then. So yeah, I mean, that's a long history of that kind of cleanliness, and this is the washing with lye. And if you don't know, lye actually comes from wood ash. If you take the ash from wood and you just run water through it, it becomes a super alkaline, known as lye. You mix that with some fat, you got soap. And wood, again, being the main resource in Scandinavia, the ground is too cold, too dark, too shallow to have a lot of crops. They couldn't grow wheat or anything. They could grow rye, you know, and some root vegetables, but they didn't have a lot of rich ores in their mountains. They didn't have a lot of mining or anything, so they just had these forests, and so everything they made was from wood, and were very much in harmony with the woods around them, and used every part of the wood that they could. And the Roman version of soap, instead of using wood ash, because they didn't have that much wood or fires going in the hearths all the time, they actually used olive oil, because the Romans had olives, and they'd actually slather themselves in olive oil and scrape it off, and it would lift up their body oils as well. So they had very different ways of doing things. Which, you know, if you're different, then you're a barbarian, apparently. and whether you're Celtic or Norse according to the Romans. So, which is why you get kind of the more modern tropes of barbarians being like Conan the Barbarian and stuff, and people thinking the Vikings had all these furs and didn't have sophisticated art and stuff is still a holdover from this Roman-centric views of how these cultures were, which wasn't true at all. They were just very racist. Nowadays, even you see a lot of people who are claiming to be, Vikings or reenacting Vikings and stuff, and they're wearing leather and they have like war paint all over them and runes and such, and you're like, that's not how they had big old furs. It's not how the Vikings dressed. They were very colorful. They loved colors, the bright reds, oranges, purples. They kept themselves very clean with the bright washed, bleached hair. Leather was very hard to come by because most of Scandinavia is just tough, like mountains and such, so you can't really have a lot of livestock. So leather was incredibly expensive. And they didn't have furs because back then fur meant it was unprocessed hide, which looked very cheap. Like nowadays we like to have like rustic antler looking knives and like furs but back then they didn't have things that were like mass produced by factories and such and had those clean, so they were striving for those clean, smooth, polished edges because that meant it took more time and work and effort into it. So they had like antler handled knives, but they were super like clean. They looked man-made and processed on purpose because that was the ideal of beauty back then. And even though nowadays it just looks super manufactured, so it's a little bit different. And so the furs just meant they didn't scrape all the fur off to get the hide of the leather. So they wouldn't wear furs because that looked super cheap. Even though nowadays we think that they had some fur trimmings, but they definitely preferred to have more processed hides. Yeah, thank you, Magical Crow, for the follow. I'm glad you guys are enjoying the other bear waving hi to you. The Vikings did Ibn Fadlan, a Muslim trader who interacted with the Rus, and who are kind of a culture that comes from the Swedish side of the Scandinavia. So over on this one particular side, who were trading Baltic slaves to the so they would go raiding, gather slaves, and sell them to the people of the Middle East. These Middle Eastern traders would come up and interact with them, and they'd mention some things they thought were really weird. Like to them, they thought it was weird that the Vikings only bathed once a week because they would bathe a lot more if they could, as a Middle Eastern culture. And they would mention that they had coal eyeliner, which they knew from the Egyptians. Just the eyeliner around the eyes, which they believed that the Vikings would wear as protection from the sun, because they didn't have sunglasses, but it helped keep that sun from reflecting back into your eyes and kind of help out a little bit. And they commented on how it looked like that they had these designs. The Norse had these designs of what they said vines that go from like the neck to their fingertips. And so we've taken this to interpret it as being maybe some tattoos of this kind of knotwork that you see from Norse like art that kind of looks like vines, and that they might have, that at least that one particular tribe might have had tattoos, large tattoos going from their neck down to their fingertips, but we haven't found any bodies or any artwork depicting these tattoos on Vikings. So like when the English were depicting battles against the Vikings and such, they didn't draw tattoos on them, and they so they think that that's kind of we don't have a lot of evidence for it, but it is a thing that is possible. So we do have, I can show you some examples of some of the Norse like artwork. some of the knotwork and stuff that they did. It goes into several different styles, but kind of during the height of the Viking Age, you had this is known as the yelling style here, and maybe we'll just kind of go in chronological order here, just real quick. So you have kind of the beginning of the Viking Age. You have what's known as the Broa style, which has kind of more like simple shapes, definitely profiled animal heads. I mean, we have human skin turned into leather, but not from the Viking Age. That was a much later German thing. And then we have the Osterberg ship, which was a great ship from that was found outside of Norway, which was the first like intact Viking ship that we actually found, and it had a lot of motifs and stuff carved onto it, and you can see that it kind of, they started incorporating more like mask shapes and kind of designs, and so you see there's kind of this like knotwork or kind of vine-like consistency to how they kind of, because this is a very stylized, abstract depiction of animals and people or deities and those kinds of things. Very, very intricate. Obviously, it took a lot of time, and they did this on everything. They find them on ear spoons. They find them on axe heads. They find these designs on the door frames of buildings. I mean, they put it everywhere. And then we have after the Osterberg style, we have kind of a simplification of the style again, with the Bore style, which is kind of fun, where instead of the profile animal heads, you start to see the animal heads looking directly at you. And the shapes are they're not quite as intricate, but they are, it's just kind of a bit simpler. And that was kind of happening around 850. And then 900 is kind of what the most people think of as the or the Mammon style. So this Mammon style I particularly like because the center known as Mammon in Denmark is actually where my family is from, originates from. It's now the Aalborg, Vigborg area in North Jylland. That's where my family originates from, and so this was kind of that center of culture in that area, the trading center. They found these motifs on axe heads and on different things, and you have this kind of like these mask motifs and these more full animal designs with all these different kind of vines coming off of it. Instead of stretching the head on one side and the feet on the other, you kind of had more together animals. They were less abstract. Which, you know, I really like drawing animals myself, so it's pretty kind of a fun connection there. And then lastly, the style that most people think of as the Viking style is the late Ernest style, and this Ernest style is kind of characterized by like really thick vines and then lots of really, really thin vines, and then some like super abstract kind of like really thin, long kind of dragon heads and such. And you see this like on the Ernest styles on the Stave Church, which is one of the oldest like buildings in Norway, that was built directly on top of the old pagan temple sites. See if I can get a good, kind of example here. Yeah, and so you see they have these more like stylized kind of like dragon heads with it. And the long cylindrical kind of like shapes and such, and so this kind of defines more of that time period. And we see a lot of these on the different like rune stones and such, and these kind of like vines and knotwork and such, and but we do know that these while they're black and white on the runestones, it's because all the paint has come off. They've actually found out that they would actually paint these designs so they'd have like black backgrounds, but then the dragons and stuff would be yellows and reds, and which were the very common kind of pigments that you could get back then. Very, very pretty. And yeah, and so no, and I love that style, and it's very characteristic. And the Celtic styles, they didn't use zoomorphic images as much. They didn't have the animal heads and wings and claws sticking out from their knotwork. They usually did mostly kind of geometric shapes that were very symmetrical. Going one way or the other way very evenly, which you can recognize more as Celtic style, while the Norse ones were very more organic, with all the little kind of bits and stuff stuck in there, which is really cool itself. Yeah, there's kind of that tangent about Viking art, and the tattoos, how those would have been kind of maybe the styles of designs that they would have done as tattoos if they had them, though we haven't had any strong evidence for it, just the literary evidence from the one story, which is a good story. If you've ever seen the movie 13th Warrior with Antonio Banderas, it's based upon that story. It's where we get the whole idea of the Jarl dying and his funeral being on this big boat that they would burn up, and the slaves would go with him into to Valhalla on his burning dragon ship. That whole thing comes from that story. But yeah, so that's how we know about those as well. So now that we have kind of the background on a lot of the culture and how we know things about the mythology and stuff, if we have any questions about that, if not, we can move on into talking about the actual basis of the mythology itself. Yeah, so even back from the Bronze Age. So what they're recently discovering is that so Atom asks, is the burial mounds tend to be boat-shaped as well, which is true. We have burial mounds in Scandinavia clear back to the Bronze Age that are all very boat-shaped. And what we've found is we've actually found remains of boats from the Bronze Age, and that they actually would have had their own Viking age in the Bronze Age. They were the Scandinavians, again, they had very tall, rugged mountains and dense forests to go through, so they couldn't travel over land very well. So they were very much a very seafaring people, and so they developed ships and stuff with their knowledge of how well wood works, that they wouldn't have to nail them together. They would just use pressures and bending the woods together so tightly that they were watertight and were super flexible, so they could bend over the big old ocean waves and such. And that they traded as far out as even as far as Egypt. They found blue beads that came from Egypt in Bronze Age graves. So we know that there was a massive trade network in Scandinavia clear from the Bronze Age, going all the way from Egypt to Ireland, and so boats were a huge part of their beliefs, and that they believed that the world itself was surrounded by a giant ocean, and to go from the world to the afterlife or the land of the gods, you traveled by boat. So the idea of the underworld being surrounded by an ocean, and so your graves were boat shaped. Those were the vessels that were carrying you. Your coffins were essentially boat shaped, carrying you into the afterlife, as you were traveling from from one realm to the other. So this is a very strong motif from Norse culture specifically, not Germanic culture, but Scandinavian culture, because they were such a strong seafaring people. Let's see here. Yeah, great question. Let me kind of get into that since we're started talking about the kind of the world. So let's kind of start with the beginning of the mythology here. I did these drawings of the mythology itself. Oh, hi, Lothar. Welcome to the our stream here. We're just discussing Norse mythology and culture and such. So this is my rendition of the cosmos of the Norse mythology, as I've interpreted it through all the different sources and such. I've took notes and kind of made different, and this is based off of weeding out from the Prose Edda when he's talking about the gods being in the sky, because that was a very kind of Christian motif that he put in, and I think they kind of rearranged the way the cosmos was after the conversion to kind of more align with the Christian idea of how the cosmos is. And so kind of weeding that out, getting that contradictory information out, allowed me to kind of build this from the other sources, which I'm quite proud of. Yeah, so I made this, and the way that the story goes is at the very beginning of time, you had just the great void, which is called Gunungagap, which is the great like nothingness of everything, right? And in this great nothingness, you see this kind of polarization in space. And on one side, you see the heat start to gather into this realm, which they call Muspelheim. And oh, thank you for the follow, Lothar. I appreciate that. It's good to have you guys. Hopefully we'll do more of these streams. We can expand more in depth in these Norse concepts. And so, I mean, I think we're having a good time here, and we might try to do these, if not every week, every other week, I think. But yeah, Gunungagap is it's a very fun word to say. Almost as fun as Bandamana Saga, which is a great saga of the outlaws in Iceland. But so yeah, on one side you have Muspelheim, the land of fire, kind of starting to manifest, and on the other polarized side of nothingness, you start to have coldness starting to manifest, and this they call the Niflheim, the land of ice and mists, and mind the Gunungagap. And these worlds start to grow and grow and grow and spread across the void until they start to touch each other, right? And once the fire starts to touch the ice, it starts to melt the ice, which kind of starts to release like this poisonous mist and starts to kind of coagulate as the ice kind of melts down into these drips, and the drips kind of solidify almost like clotting blood. They coagulate into this form, and this form is the very first being of the universe named Ymir. And Ymir is he's a giant, he's massive. What's known as the Himthurs, or the frost giants, are from his children, and he starts to have children by his right foot mating with his left foot, obviously, or he starts to sweat them out from his armpits, and they're like, in the stories, they're like, okay, well, what did he eat, this first being, and like, well, there was this giant primordial cow named Athumla, and Athumla, which means the one without horns. So it's a a cow that has no horns, and from its udders it has 4 streams of milk just continually flowing out. And from the stream, that's what the Emir would consume and live off of, you know. Um, Again, we don't know where Thumla came from. I'm guessing maybe she also coagulated out of the ice. But, you know, cosmic space cow milk, you know, in our Milky Way galaxy, it makes sense. Anyway. And so, Nightbot's just picking fights with everyone. You have this cow Thumla, and Thumla starts eating the ice itself. She starts licking it. You know, like if you've ever seen a cow with a salt lick. The cows have to lick these big old rocks to get the salt off. And so she does this to this primordial like ice. And from this ice, she starts to uncover the head of the first of the Aesir. And the first being of the Aesir is Bor. And Bor, then after he's all freed from the ice, he marries one of the daughters of Emir, and they have kids, Buri and Bestla. And this starts with the family of gods known as the Aesir, the higher beings, known as the Asir, and individually known as an Os. So he was the first Os, and then you have Emir, who started this beings of giants. So they're very much similar, though two very distinct families from these beginnings, these clans, but they're very similar, kind of just greater cosmic beings that exist in the universe. And so you have so let me see if I can get some more pictures here. So this is kind of a depiction of a Thumla. I didn't draw this one, but I did modify it to take the horns off, because etymologically it means the hornless one, and somebody drew it with horns on it. But and let's see. So you have the Asir, and so you have Buri, who is the first of the family, who I've drawn here. I've depicted him in some Stone Age clothing, kind of based off of the Iceman that they found in Northern Europe. So, you know, that's pretty fun. And then in his name this is Buri there. And then going on to Bjorn and Bestla, his children I drew here, and them I have depicted in your typical kind of Bronze Age attire for the Germanic Norse people. And so the giants and such, they're not, a lot of them are very ugly, a lot of them are monsters, but then a lot of them aren't. And obviously the Aussie are just going to marry the really pretty ones. But yeah, you can have a good depiction there with kind of an Arctic tundra behind them. So Bor and Bestla have 3 kids, and the most famous of these is going to be Odin, and then they have in some stories Vili and Ve. In other stories, it's instead of Vili, it's Honir, and instead of Ve, it's what's his name? It's starts with an L. No, I don't have it on my notes here. Yep. Yeah, so obviously beautiful monster girls were a thing back then too, obviously. But yeah, so let's kind of start talking about, so they have these three kids. They'll bring up Odin here, and Odin, he's kind of the king of the gods, you know. His great deeds, he's kind of the great patron of the Asir family of gods, and he's a god of wisdom, and he decides with his two brothers, we'll just do Vili and Ve for now, that they needed to create a place to live, right? So they were going to use only material that they had, and they were going to kill Ymir, the great first being, who was creating all these kind of monstrous children and stuff, and they were going to carve the world from him. And so they kill him, and they use his skull to create a great sky dome, you know, around this new land known as Mythgard, or Midgard, which is the middle world, because it's the middle world between Muspelheim and Niflheim. And from his body, they create all the land that is made up for Mythgard, Jotunheim, and Vanaheim. And they take his eyebrows, and they create a great wall around this Mythgard, this middle world, in order to keep all of the Jotnar, or the giants, out, and so that they can't attack this world, right? And they take his brains and they swirl him into the clouds of the sky. They take his teeth, they make the rocks and the mountains from it, and all of the great ocean that surrounds everything is his blood, you know, all water. So he's just a being of water and earth and air, and then you have fire and ice that created him. So you have this kind of primordial being, not so different from the Titans being killed by the Olympians in Greek mythology. You have the first Jotnar, and that was killed by Odin, Vili, and Ve to create the world. And so from that they create this whole world, and they decide, you know, they're going to start, you know, families of their own. Odin marries Frigg, whose origins is unknown by this point. You know that other beings start to pop up from the land. They say kind of like maggots coming out of flesh. You have this byproduct of creating the earth. You have the dwarves and the elves starting to emerge and come from this new creation. So they weren't intentionally created, they were just kind of like a byproduct of creation, and they're like the spirits of the land. Kind of like the idea that once a body dies, you know, they didn't know about flies laying maggots, eggs. They just see these maggots start to appear. So it's kind of that same kind of idea, that it's just a transformation from the flesh into these living entities, these smaller living entities. And that's going to be the dwarves, which are your dark elves that live inside the rocks. And you have the elves, the beings of the light elves, who kind of are the spirits of the forest and the lands. And the forest being made, of course, from the hair of Ymir. And so you have that going on. And so they have these other beings, and Odin, Vili, and Ve stumble across some driftwood on the beach. And the driftwood looks like it had been kind of carved up by the dwarves into these like humanoid shapes, but they had no destiny, no life about them, nothing. And these three gods decide that it would be kind of nice to have their own beings that they're intentionally creating to populate this world with, kind of grow And so they created the first. They take the ash wood, and they make Oscar, the first man, and they take the elm wood and they make Embla, and make the first woman, Embla. So Oscar and Embla, the first human beings to exist in the world, and they just set them out to kind of populate this world, and they're going to protect them from the giants who are going to try and eat them. That's what the Jotnar literally means, is the great devourers or eaters of people. Yeah, I mean, absolutely, if you're familiar with the Silmarillion and the lore of Tolkien, you can see where he took a lot of this. And again, because he was trying to create a new mythology for modern England. And so modern England being a culture that's combining the Celts and the Norse, or the old Germanic tales. And so he took a lot of inspiration from those and worked them into his fantasy world there. So yeah, and so that's kind of the basis of how the cosmos got started, how people got started, and they're kind of placed. So the people are almost built to kind of serve as lesser beings, servants for the gods, right? But kind of like kings ruling over lower class people, you know, where individuals are probably not very important unless they make themselves very important to this higher class of beings, which are the gods. And somewhere in all this, there emerges a family known as the Vanir, and this is a different family of gods. Oh, thank you so much for the follow, Kokorin. Yeah, I'm glad that we're getting more and more people here. Yeah, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask at any time. We'll definitely adjust the conversation for this. This is to be a dialogue here. But yeah, so you have this rival family called the Vanir, and they're the very first war happens in the cosmos. I mean, I guess because there wasn't really a war. The first like slaughter happened with the Ymir, but then you have this first like people versus people, or god versus god war happened between the Vanir and the Asir, and the Asir eventually win this war against the Vanir, and they exchange hostages. As what you do after war as a sign to keep the peace, you know. So you can no longer attack us anymore. We'll kill your hostage, and vice versa, you know. So the Vanir give up Freya and her brother Freyr and their father Njordur as hostages, and in return, the Asir give them Mimir and Honir as hostages, and Mimir being like the most intelligent of beings, and Honir being very beautiful but not being very smart himself, and the Vanir eventually start to feel kind of like they've been tricked. Because Honir only will speak if he has the counsel of Mimir, you know, and being really like dumb kind of makes you not very useful to their society, and so they end up getting mad about this kind of deceit, and they end up killing Mimir. They cut his head off, and Odin, using the magics that he's accumulated over time, he takes Mimir's head and he preserves it with herbs, and then he reincarnates it with like a necromancy kind of magic, which he does a lot. In the Poetic Edda, it kind of starts out with we know these stories about the creation of the cosmos because Odin takes the grave of a great seer, which are called the Volva, which are witches in Norse culture, and he brings her back to life, and Odin has her tell him all these stories, which is kind of like a great like narration about the beginning of time and where it goes off into the end of time. And so the Vanir cut off Mimir's head to prove that Honir was useless without him, which they did, and they got very upset with. and Odin preserves the head and keeps Mimir's counsel. So Odin's depicted now as walking around carrying the head of Mimir here, because he's the only person smart enough to talk to, and so he wouldn't let him die. And so Odin saved him. He didn't cut off his head. It was the Vanir that did. And a lot of the happenstances about this war have been lost over time. The manuscripts that were supposed to talk, there's like pages missing from the Poetic Edda that actually talk more about this conflict. Oh, thank you. Which is, yeah, you guys like my blue nails? I'm quite proud of them. Autumn actually did these, and they're great. But yeah, so we don't know a lot about the war, but we know that the Aesir end up winning and being the main predominant family over the time. And let me see, I gotta get a couple of pictures here. So then the Aesir in exchange got the Vanir, Njordur, Freya, and Freyr. So we have Njordur here. And if you guys want to take a break, need a stretch or anything, just let me know. I think Atom's getting me water because I was ill prepared. I could go a Viking and just break into my mead, but I have my drinking horn here, the little bear motif on it. I think it's up there. Yeah, so I have my drinking horn, but yeah, Lazenka. Sorry if I slaughter your names, but again, I'm more used to Norse pronunciations. But yeah, Ragnarok is then the end of time. So you have the beginning of times, the cosmogony, which we just talked about, and then the end of times, the twilight of the gods, being Ragnarok. And it's not really an end of times. It's more of just the end of the story of the gods, because that's where the gods end up dying, but then the world gets renewed and continues on afterwards. So everything kind of exists within a cycle. While everything changes and dies, everything also continues in a new form. A lot like nature, every year, going into winter and everything dying and coming back again in the spring. Is just kind of how they saw the world, living so closely in connection with nature. Thank you. A little ASMR here. So this is a gift I got from a coworker that they said that it made them think of me, so they got it. Which, does kind of bring up a fun talking point the Vakam, die in battle, go to Valhalla. The idea of Valhalla, or in Old Norse you call it Valhall, is for this Ragnarok that we were talking about at the end of times. Odin knows there's going to be this great war between the Jotnar, the Asir, and the hordes of Muspelheim, and all the dead people. And so what Odin intends to do is he tends to gather all the greatest warriors of mankind, and he trains them in his battleground, his hall, his golden hall, which is called the Valhall, the hall of the Val, or the slain. And these warriors are chosen by the Valkyria, the Val, the choosers of the slain, and they take them to Valhalla, where they feast every night on mead and pork, and then every day they go out and they fight each other in big old battles and kill each other. And every night they get brought back to the made whole again, so they can keep on feasting. It's this perpetual cycle of feasting, fighting, and fucking, and in this all man's boys club. So I mean, you do have quite a bit of assuming that they're not actually, because the Valkyries aren't supposed to marry or be with anyone, so assuming that they're just fucking each other. So in Valhall, you have these warriors who are being gathered for the end of times, for Ragnarok, for this great battle. And that's kind of Odin's great plan is to gather all these warriors together, and in this warrior man's club. And a lot of people think of it as like the Norse heaven, but not so much. I mean, a lot of Vikings, if you proved yourself a good enough warrior, then obviously you'd be useful in the final days. And so, but he does have limited space. There's only like 5,800 warriors that are supposed to like come out during Ragnarok. So according to the numbers given in the Voluspa, so you have to be in the top 6,000 people of all time in order to warriors of all time in order to get there. So but yeah, and Odin, he's known as a trickster and a liar and a thief, which is interesting for your kind of main king of the gods, because he'll protect you and he'll help you win battles and become this great warrior, and then he will make sure that you die in battle so that you can go to Valhalla. Nobody who's a good enough warrior is going to die outside of battle, because that's how you know you were chosen, is you're going to die in battle. Even if you're like the best warrior, some kid's going to come along and get a cheap shot and kill you, and that's why that happens, is because you're being chosen for Valhalla. Yeah, and like Etam says, out of the billions of people who ever live, only like 6,000 are going to be chosen, which, is probably why the gods lose, I guess. You know, 200 hours on Valhalla. I mean, that's a good accomplishment. So maybe. I mean, if Mugger comes along and shoots you in the back of the head, we'll know you were chosen for Valhalla. But yeah, kind of as a Norse pagan myself, I see people writing stories about like a kid being a great warrior fighting against cancer, and I like. I appreciate the sentiment of it, they were a great warrior, everybody's going through their own struggles and such, but a kid would not want a kid to go to Val. It's not a place for kids, and your everyday people, they die and they go to hell, which is this realm down here, across the Gjallabru, which is the bridge between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead. And hell's cold. on one side because it connects to Niflheim, which is why people get cold after they die, you know. And all the really bad people, who oath breakers, those who steal the spouses of other people, you know, all those particularly bad people, they get tortured in Nastron, the castle of torture, or they get eaten by Nithog, the great dragon, in hell. But the rest of hell is actually not bad. That's where most of the dwarves live. That's where all your family's gonna go, and it's just this life after life, you know. And the Norse, they believe that life would continue in the afterlife just much like it did in this life, because they would bury people with all their favorite things that they would need in the afterlife, including ear spoons, combs, very physical things to just kind of like take care of yourself, your favorite like swords and such, you know, you'd need in this afterlife. And the idea of the afterlife just basically is the grave. In stories where Odin rides with his warriors from Valhalla on great wild hunts and such, they come back to the realm of the living through the grave. These graves are literal doorways into this underworld. So this kind of physical and conceptual idea is kind of, there's not a strict distinction between the two, between the realm of hell and the physical grave. They're kind of the same, which is quite a bit different than how in modern times a lot of the Christian society views the afterlife, being purely of spirit and not as physical. It's quite a bit different in this worldview. But yeah, and that's where most people go. You're just going to go to hell, and you're going to meet all your ancestors, and you're just going to live there until Ragnarok, where all hell gets emptied into this great battle, you know. And so you have Valhalla, you have hell, and then some people believe that there's different gods have different halls themselves that people go to, like Bilskirnir, the hall of Thor. In one particular saga, Odin says is the hall of thralls and the hall of carls, or the lower classes of Norse society, the slaves and regular people, while Odin, he has great warriors and kings and jarls in his hall. There's this big like conflict of this like class war between Odin and Thor, where Odin, being the king of kings, you know, the god of kings, and being upper class and kind of a liar, and he's a god who the ends always justify the means, while Thor is very much a kind of moral in the moment, always do what's right, courageously straightforward kind of guy. Even though he's Odin's son, he represents more, and he protects your regular people, your everyday people in Midgard. He actually goes to Midgard and fights off the Jotnar, the giants who are trying to eat them. And where he's more about the current conflict than the future conflict of Ragnarok. So you have this whole saga where Odin and Thor are just throwing insults at each other because of this like class tension, this different ideologies of morality. Yeah, and you know, and a lot of people try to make Odin out to be this like all watchful, all father who loves and cares over everyone, coming from the religious trauma of a Christian society, but it's just not the case. You know, he's like a liar. He doesn't care about you. He doesn't know you. But Thor is more of your protective father figure, and he is literally a father. He has children that he has and cares for it like babies. Modi Magni and his daughter Thruther, and he's depicted as like an actual fatherly figure and a protector of mankind. Oh yeah, good luck, MJ. Thank you for stopping by. It was I'm really glad you were able to be here. Yeah, and I'll release the VODs afterwards. Yeah, and people should be able to clip anything if they find anything particularly interesting. Good luck at your appointment. Yeah. Let's see. So where was I? I talked about Thor and Hell. Rat facts. Don't think I know a lot of Norse rat facts, unfortunately. Unless you count Ratatosk, the squirrel. He's kind of like a rat. So, Ratatosk being the squirrel who he runs down to the roots of Yggdrasil, the world tree, and he gathers gossip and hurls insults at the dragon Nidhogg, who's eating on the roots of the world tree, and he runs back up to the eagle at the top and exchanges gossip and shares the insults that Nidhogg had about to the eagle, and comes back down again. And it's a little mischievous squirrel who's just passing on messages to grumpy cosmological beings. So yeah, so we've established kind of where Mythgard comes from. Jotunheim is these wild lands. It's important when you're looking at the world of the Norse cosmology, you know the difference between a Gard and a Heim. So a Garth, like Asgarth, Midgarth, these are lands that are encircled. They're by a fence. It's kind of a civilized area, right? While a Heim is a wild land. It's a land that's outside, an unsettled, untamed, uncivilized land. So Jotunheim being these wild lands around Midgard, Niflheim being the wild ice land, Muspelheim the wild fire land. You have Vanaheim, which is kind of like the world of the Vanir, which is kind of this wild world. Alfheim, a wild land of the elves, but then you have Asgarth, which is encircled in its own walls to protect it from the Jotnar, the giants. And so to know those differences, you kind of get an idea of the different thoughts behind these different realms. Where you have Thrutherheim, which is the land of strength where Thor resides in, and he walks across the rivers to fight the Jotnar, and he lives close to Mythgarth, but he cannot walk across the Bifrost Bridge, which is the bridge that goes from Asgarth to Mythgarth, because the red in the rainbow, which is the Bifrost Bridge, is literally fire, which will burn up any the Jotnar that try to cross it, and apparently Thor too, because I think Thor was actually fostered by a family of Jotnar when he was a child, though the reasons why that happened don't really survive, but there are references to it. And so he grew up with the Jotnar and is also the great Jotnar slayer. He also and he's the only god that can't. Him and Loki usually travel together, and so they don't go on Bifrost. But yeah, and so Asgard they set up their own hall here. We'll have to kind of zoom in a little bit, kind of get into the specifics. I will last thing about Mythgarth here. Again, the D with the line through it is a soft TH sound, in case you were wondering that. So Mythgarth instead of Midgard. In modern Norwegian, though, it does change from th to d, and so it is Midgard or Odin in modern. But in the Old Norse, it's Mythgarth, or in Icelandic, it's Mythgarth or Odin. But the skull, the sky, is actually being held up by 4 dwarves. You have Northri, the dwarf in the north, Vestri, the dwarf in the west, Ostri, the dwarf in the east, and Suthri, the dwarf of the south, north, south, east, and west. So they hold up the sky and kind of embody those cardinal directions. And it's interesting to think of dwarves holding up the sky, saying that dwarves aren't necessarily short. later folklore has them being seen as short creatures, elves being seen as short creatures. But Jotnar are the early conceptions of trolls, and the trolls are, and Jotnar, they're translated into giants, but they aren't necessarily giant. They come in many shapes and sizes, but they are usually taller than people are. Yeah, so we come over here, and so the Asgard Aesir see, you know, in Marvel they call them the Asgardians, but they're the Aesir. They come to this new land and they create a court called Ithovolur, and in this court they start setting up around their own different halls. And in the middle of this great court, they have Uthabrun, which is the Well of Fate. And they have these three beings who live at this well. And they're called the Nornir, or the Norns. And these Nornir are the beings who weave fate. And there's a very strong idea of fate in Norse culture that on the day of your birth, the Nornir have already decreed the day of your death, and there's no avoiding that. You're always going to die. It's going to be your fate. Okay, so Mythgarth has the sky for day and night, right? Captain Toof was wondering. So what Asgarth has is when the sky gets set down by the dwarves, we have nighttime, right? And so this is the night sky, and the night sky is the great void of Gnungagap that is filled with the sparks that are flying out from Muspelheim. Those are the stars that we see out in the night sky, and this stretches out clear over the entire void, and is caught up in the branches of Yggdrasil, the World Tree, and the World Tree grew up out of this Well of Fate, and its branches spread out over all of the worlds, which is why it's called the World Tree, you know. And it has its own kind of like fruit, you know. And what's really interesting is that it's said that Yggdrasil, with its great branches over the world, like sap dripping from it onto the ground, you get honeydew. That's where honeydew comes from, is these drippings off of the World Tree, which I've kind of depicted here. And honeydew, dripping down from Yggdrasil towards the world, is then picked up and eaten by bees and turned into honey. And then we take honey and we ferment it and we turn it into mead, which is why mead is such a sacred thing in Norse culture, is it actually comes from this cosmological, it originates from this cosmological tree, you know, tying us directly to this power of the gods and the cosmos. And then it's believed that intoxication is actually a form of like magic and altered consciousness. Odin being a god of ecstasy and these altered conscious states is like a gift from the gods to get drunk. You're empowered by this alcohol. Have dinner for sure. And yeah, and the dwarfs do get breaks and probably did unionize. But yeah, have a nice dinner, Magic, and yeah, keep lurking. I'll be answering, you know, pop in if you have any questions or anything, and I should have VODs available. But yeah, eat some pickled herring for the Vikings. Yeah, so kind of establishing more of the the world that the mythology is happening in. You have the world, and there's swans in the well of fate. And there's 3 great wells that the world tree grows out of. There's Ithabrun in Asgarth. Then there's Mimir's Brun, or Mimir's well, in Jotunheim. So he actually Mimir has his own well there, and Mimir himself might have actually been a Jotun instead of one of the Aesir, but he just was like part of the Aesir group that they exchanged as a hostage. And it was in here that Odin sacrificed his eye to be able to see, for wisdom, to gain wisdom. He sacrificed his eye, which is why Odin only has one eye, and he gave it a sacrifice into that well, so that his eye is down there at the bottom of that well. And then Odin himself pierced himself onto the tree with his spear, and hung there for 9 days and 9 nights. And when he did this, he had visions of the runes which he pulled up from the well. So I have that depicted here, the runes being pulled up from the well, and the runes being magical symbols, but the magic of them is their ability to preserve and translate language, and then there's also ideas that since they can preserve language and words, they can preserve intention. So a lot of Norse spell work is writing a word of intention in runes and then just hiding it somewhere, like if you had a charm against trolls, you'd write the runes for touch above it, and then those runes, even if they couldn't see the runes, the intention's there, and it would compel them to touch that iron charm that would turn the trolls away, or if you wanted somebody to fall in love with you, you'd say, love so and so, and you'd hide that under a place where they'd walk over it often, and even as they walked over it, those intention would affect them, and they would start to fall in love with that person. And we see this a lot in old Icelandic grimoires, books of magic and such, and so that's kind of the magic of the runes. There's a lot of Nazi propaganda and stuff that came about in the turn of the 19th century about each rune having its own meaning and being a divination thing, and they just used the Elder Futhark, and I mean we can talk a lot more. I can have a whole lecture about runes itself, but they're definitely very misunderstood, and there's a lot of misinformation about runes out there, especially as it pertains to actual Old Norse culture and not modern occultism. But yeah, so and then the third well that I mentioned, so they have the one coming from Jotunheim, and then the last one actually is a well that is in Niflheim. It kind of sits on the edge between in Hell and Niflheim. It's described as being in both, and from it are all of these rivers that go out and they cross over through Jotunheim, and there's just these long lists of river names in sagas, and we know that Gjöll is the river that divides the world of life and death, and we have the river of swords and the rivers of snakes, and I mean just all these different rivers that come out from that well, that kind of feed, and these rivers all feed all the waters of the world, all the other rivers and oceans and stuff throughout the rest of the world. So this is the source of all water, comes from here, which I guess is maybe where Ymir died, or his blood is originating from, because everything flows from that. Yeah, and so we have the world of Asgarth here, and the world tree that branches out over it. You have Alfheim, you have Vanaheim, and Þrúðheim. So these are all kind of upper beings, gods and such, kind of all living in the same area. The elves might have been elevated up to, the light elves might have been elevated up to this post-Christianity. Making out angels to be like light elves is a possibility, but we can't prove that false or correct. But then you also have the dark elves, which are the dwarves, and they reside down in hell. And the distinction between like dwarves and elves and even spirits of the dead get like blurry. They didn't need to keep things so clean. You know, the elves lived within these big burial mounds where you put the dead. You know, you make offerings there. But these were, so elves could be, you know, long dead people that nobody remembers, or they could just be, you know, spirits of the land. Essentially, the most ambiguous word that we have that compares to it, to their idea of elf, is spirit. Because to us, a spirit could be a ghost, it could be a land spirit, and it's this very obscure concept. So a more direct translation of elf is spirit, because it also vaguely encompasses all of these things. Yeah, and so we have those are kind of the most important parts of this cosmology. You have Hel, who's ruled over by the being named Hel, who's daughter of Loki. You can recognize her because she's depicted as being half flesh-colored, half corpse-colored. Corpse-color being kind of a dark bluish to dark reddish purple color, the color that corpses turn after a while. This is the same color that ravens are. This is the same color that Odin's cloak's made out of. The blar is the color is in Old Norse, and so she's half blar and half living, so half dead. And then you have Loki's child Fenrir, who's a Jotun in great wolf form, and after he was bound, you might have heard that story. I can go more into that story. But he lives in hell with her now. And then you have Jormungandr, the great world serpent, who encircles in the sea around Midgard. And so these three monstrous kind of children come from Loki and his mistress, Jotnar mistress Ingrabotha. Loki actually has an Aesir wife, Sigyn, but he tends to he has this mistress, this Jotnar mistress, who he actually has kids with, because it seems like he can't have kids with her. And Loki kind of was brought into the ranks. He was born a Jotnar and was brought into the family of the Aesir by becoming blood brothers with Odin. Odin finding him to be, useful. But a lot of the specifics around why, whether Loki saved his life or what, we don't know, because that story doesn't carry on into the modern age. But what we do know is that they are blood brothers, and so Loki is considered amongst the Aesir, and that Odin will not accept any drink if it's not also offered to Loki. That's mentioned specifically as part of the oath, and in Lokasena, one of the sagas from the Poetic Edda. Look there. Warhammer 2 campaign. Nice. I mean, Norse mythology, werewolves, it's all cool. The other part of the cosmology that's pretty important is the sun and the moon. A lot of stories in mythologies talk about the origins of these items in the cosmology. We know that the soul is the sun, and in Norse mythology, soul is a woman, and she is the sun, or carries the sun in a chariot across the sky. And Mani is the moon, which is male, which is different in a lot of mythologies except for Japanese Shintoism. where you have Amaterasu being the goddess of the sun, and yeah, and it's interesting because you have like in Greek and a lot of the other cultures, you have the opposite, where the sun being is like a usually masculine, I'm guessing, because it's seen as like a dominant figure, and the moon being more associated with women because of like menstrual cycles and such. But in Norse, the sun was more important because it controls like the seasons, you know. And when the sun comes back, that's the only time life comes back, and the only ones who have the ability to create life are women. So it makes sense that the sun is female, you know, imbuing that life, creating energy back into the world. And so, and they're, you know, so these are being pulled across the sky. They go across to Mythgarth, and they come back, and they go over Asgarth, and they, you know, just cycling around, being pulled on chariots. Soul being pulled by the horse Skinfaxi, or a shining mane, and Mani being pulled by Hrimfaxi, Faxi meaning horse in Old Norse, or mane in Old Norse, and Hrim meaning frost, so a frost mane, kind of. And then there's Mani is said to have these two servants, these two kids who follow him around, named Huki and Bill, and we're not sure exactly what this depicts like in as far as what you can see in the night sky, except maybe those are the moon dogs that you see when a storm's going to come. Yeah, and so yeah, but that's the sun and the moon, and they're being chased by wolves. So Engraboda is continually just popping out the brood of Fenrir, which is either Fenrir's extended family or his direct children, which means Fenrir's, you know, having kids with his mom. But of this brood, you have Hati, the wolf who chases the moon across the sky, and Skjold, the wolf who chases the sun. And in Ragnarok, the sun is supposed to get swallowed by either Fenrir the wolf or Skjold. And so these are you know, monstrous wolves. These aren't like regular wolves. But there is a theme with wolves. There's kind of this literary motif. Wolves are always associated and described as being hungry, just ravenous, insatiable hunger. So you have wolves, like the animals, that are always like considered to be hungry, and then you have giants who are, if they have an insatiable hunger, take the form of great wolves. You know, Hati trying to eat the moon continually, Skull trying to eat the sun, and Fenrir who was going to devour the whole world. So let's talk about the story of Fenrir and Tyr real quick. So the story with Fenrir is that you have Loki presents this his son, who's this wolf, and Tyr kind of fosters him. Tyr being this god of like justice. He's the god who oversees like personal duels. Like if you have a irreconcilable differences and you need to know who's right and who's wrong, you'd usually have a duel to the death called a holmgang. If you've insulted somebody too many times, you know, they can regain their honor. The only way to regain back honor is through holmgang. And the gods will make sure that the person who is correct wins in this sacred fight, this duel, you know. So this kind of god, Tyr being in charge of the god over the holmgang and duels, makes him a god of justice. You know, that's justice being sought through in Norse culture. And so, and Tyr's a god of doing what's best for the community and doing what's right, even at self-sacrifice. And so he fosters Fenrir, and Fenrir starts to grow, and he just grows and grows and grows, and he becomes terrifyingly huge, and he's just going to start devouring everything in sight in the whole world. So the the gods are like, we gotta bind him, you know, we gotta stop him from devouring everything, you know, this like insatiable hunger. And yeah, Lothar, yeah, there's a Holmgang in the show Norseman. I love that show. It makes me laugh a lot. And yeah, if you kill somebody with Holmgang, you are then entitled to their lands and property and such, which is where berserkers became such a problem for Norse society, was because they were super strong fighters, but they were terrible people who were very antisocial and very anti-societal. And so they'd come in, challenge somebody to Holmgang, kill them, take all their stuff, sell all their stuff to make some quick money, and then just move on to the next place because they were wandering bandits, you know. And so because of that, berserkers had to get outlawed because they were abusing this justice system. Berserkers also being extreme, like fanatical devotees of Odin, where again they're trying to get the Valhall. The most important thing is to be good in battle, and that's the only thing that matters, is to be good enough to fight and win in Ragnarok, right? Everything else can get sacrificed for that. There's this whole like totemship between bears and the berserkers, and giving them the berserker rage, where they can't get hurt by any weapons, but they also can't know friend from foe, and they go into a frenzy. And some people guess that they may have been ingesting substances for that, but I feel like that does a disservice towards the kind of totem ability of it. A lot of people nowadays are like, "Oh, I'm a berserker." I'm like, well, one, you don't want to be, but two, prove it. You know, go into a rage and let me hit you with an axe and see if you get hurt or not. And berserkers, when they were traveling, they would entertain people for room and board by going into the longhouse and walking across the fire coals. They were fire walkers, and they wouldn't get hurt. And that would be a way that they would entertain people and earn their food and board while they were traveling. So yeah, I mean, if you could walk across hot coals, you know, and go into a rage of intense strength like a bear, then yeah, you can call yourself a berserker. But they're also, berserkers are supposed to be a genetic trait that is inherited through family lines. It's not something that it's like you get initiated in, and then it becomes almost like a family curse that's passed on as your family shares the same luck and stuff that you have. Yeah, there was on Stamford Bridge, there was a tale of a berserker who held off all the people who were trying to cross the bridge in this great battle, and until they took the pikes and they stabbed them up through the bottom of the bridge, he wasn't able to be taken out, which is a really cool story. But yeah, let's see, I got onto berserkers. Oh yeah, because of Tyr. So Tyr, being the god of justice, decides to try and bind Fenrir so that he won't devour the whole world, and he takes it upon himself because, you know, doing the right thing is best for everyone, the whole world. And so he tells Fenrir, you know, let's play a game. Let's see if you can break out of these ropes, you know. And Fenrir's like, okay, yeah, I'm strong enough, you know, I'm cool enough. This is a test of might, a way to gain honor, which is important in Norse society, to prove your strength and your usefulness by being stronger and bringing that kind of reputation towards your family. And so he breaks out of the ropes, and Tyr's like, okay, yeah, you know, you're strong enough, but let's see if you can break through these chains, you know. And so he chains Fenrir up, and Fenrir's like, yeah, I can break out of these. And he moves and he breaks out of the chains, and Tyr's like, okay, let me come back one more time. And he goes to the dwarves, and he's like, hey, I need something that can like hold anything, absolutely anything, you know. And the dwarves are like, yeah, we can make something for you. And they make this ribbon, this fine like golden ribbon, and they make it out of the footfalls of a cat and the roots of a mountain and the spittle of a bird and all these things that no longer exist in the world. They took these kind of animistic concepts and removed them from the world and created this ethereal ribbon out of it. And they give this to Tyr, and so Tyr goes back to Fenrir and says, okay, I got this ribbon, let's see if you can break out of this. And Fenrir's like, well, this is very suspicious. It's just a ribbon, you know. He's like, I don't like this. He's like, well, I'm going to need one of you, Aesir, to put your hand in my mouth as collateral, so that if I can't break out of this, you will let me out, or I'll bite your hand off. And so Tyr, he
he says, okay, I'll do it. You know, he puts his hand in Fenrir's mouth, and they bind him with the ribbon, and he thrashes and he thrashes, and Fenrir can't get out. He says, okay, let me out, and Tyr's like, I'm sorry, I can't. And so he bites off Tyr's hand, his sword fighting hand, and which is a great sacrifice for a god of duels. And and with that, Fenrir is bound, no longer able to devour the world, and will only be released at Ragnarok, when everything falls apart. Then he'll come out, and Fenrir will actually be the one to eat Odin himself. But they took a sword and they put it in Fenrir's mouth, so he could not eat anything. They put the hilt at his tongue and the tip at the roof of his mouth, so he could never close his mouth again. And they sent him down to hell, and from his mouth these rivers flow out of just drool, and it created this lake around him. And so if you go to hell, you're supposed to see this great lake, Almsvatnir, and the island Lyngvi, and in the middle of that island you'll see Fenrir dwelling down in the underworld, waiting for Ragnarok. Yeah, and and all these stories are poems, so there's a lot of beautiful poetic imagery and symbolism and stuff that's going to be imbued in these stories. Poems being really easy to remember, long tales, and being able to recount. And usually the Norse would be working very hard during the summer, working from sun up to sundown, which in Scandinavia, in the Arctic Circle, was like 20 out of the 24 hours a day. You'd be working during the summer, and then during the winter there was no sun. It was just dark, it was cold, you'd be trapped inside with just your family, your servants, and your animals, and you would pass on these stories, telling these great poems, and you'd even have travelers traveling through who could recite these stories, skalds, going through and reciting the stories and passing on new stories of sagas and mythologies and such. So very, very, very powerful imagery, which is one thing I really love about the Norse culture and mythology. These images definitely stay with you, I think. But yeah, so that's the story of Fenrir. And so that kind of establishes most of the world in which this mythology exists in. The World Tree and Mythgard and Niflheim, and these are known as like the 9 realms. Realms, not just worlds, because you have different realms on a single world, which is the only way that this kind of whole cosmology makes sense. You have a lot of people trying to make each realm into a world of its own, hanging in the branches of the tree, and it just gets really like convoluted, and it doesn't quite add up to how things are laid out in the stories. We do know that the Aesir are supposed to always be in the east, that we know that Asgarth exists in the east, but then there's also Jotnar in the east too, and they're encircling Mythgard. So in this map that I made, you have Jotunheim encircling all of Mythgarth, and so you have to still pass through Jotunheim to get to Asgarth. So in the east, and then in the furthest east, you have Asgard and the realm of the gods, where the sun rises from, which kind of connects. So everything really is very reflective of patterns in nature, and it was just these observations of nature that kind of built this whole cosmology. This is very real to them. This is why things exist that way. And so I find that very relatable to my experiences of nature as well. Seeing these things, it makes sense. And these stories have truths in that sense, that maybe if the stories aren't quite literal the morals behind them and stuff are still very true. The symbology behind them teaches truths. Yeah, so any questions about anything so far? Everybody getting kind of bored. see, it's 4 o'clock here, so we've been at this for about 2 hours. Yeah. Let's see. So there maybe a couple of more stories to kind of explain a couple of more things that we've already seen so far. We can go more in depth with more gods and stuff. But you notice that there's around Asgarth there's a wall, and because they need to protect themselves from the Jotnar as well, you know, the only person who's really willing to be in conflict with them directly is Thor. They're all pretty afraid of him, but there's this story of the wall builder who's going to, you know, the gods wanted to build a wall, but they felt the manual labor of building a wall was kind of beneath them. And there was this wall builder who shows up, and he's like, "Hey, yeah, I can." You know, he's like, "I can build a wall for you. That's not a problem, but you know, it's going to be a lot of work to encircle your whole realm here. So as payment, I want you to give me Freya, goddess of beauty, to you know, to be mine as payment for this." And Loki comes up with a cunning plan, you know, saying, you know, well, obviously we can't give Freya away, you know, but we also, you know, don't want to build a wall. So I think we can get both, have a wall and keep Freya if we make a wager out of it, you know, saying, if you can build the wall within a certain amount of time, you can have this most cherished prize. But if you can't, then we don't have to pay anything at all. And you know, Odin's like, yeah, this makes sense. You know, I like that. So they agree with the wall builder that that's what they're going to do. Is he has to build this wall within like 9 weeks. You know, otherwise he doesn't get anything. So the builder agrees, and he starts hewing out large stones, and they're like, yeah, he'll never be able to complete this in time. We'll be fine, you know. And all of a sudden he brings along his horse, and this horse is just this giant, monstrous horse. It is a Jotun in the form of a horse, and this thing can carry massive stones. I mean, and so him and the builder himself, they find out, is also a Jotnar, a giant. So these two are just building this wall like crazy. You know, the AC are thinking that the Jotnar, that this builder was just a regular person, you know. And so they start building this wall and building this wall in 9 days, like, you know, about 8 weeks passed, and they're just about done with this wall, you know. They're getting through the 9th week, and everybody's getting really scared, and Freya's getting kind of pissed that you know, they're gonna lose this wager. And so Odin turns to Loki and is like, "This was your idea. You have to do whatever it takes to fix this." And Loki says, "Okay, I will go and fix this." And he tries, you know, turning himself into a fly and biting the guy's face, and he will not be deterred. He tries all sorts of different things, and Loki decides that the best thing to do is to turn himself into a mare. So he turns himself into a female horse, and he goes up to the male horse, and he leads him away, because you know, you just can't resist the temptation of sex there. And so he leads off, and without his horse there, the builder cannot finish his the wall in time. And as Loki led off the horse, and then Thor shows up, and the gods the builder explains, you know, that he's been cheated, and Thor's not very happy about this this dishonorable kind of misleading, like, wager that happened in general. but he can't abide any Jotnar in Asgard, so he kills the builder right off the bat. And but he chastises the other gods for being so dishonorable and being willing to put Freya's life in danger that way. And they don't see Loki for a long time, for about 9 months, in fact. And when he finally comes back, he delivers a gift to Odin as an apology. And this gift is a little horse with 8 legs, a baby horse. The implication being that Loki gave birth to this horse after leading the other horse away. And that is where Odin gets his 8-legged steed Sleipnir. That with all 8 legs is so fast that it can run through the air and carries Odin around anywhere he needs to go, and is actually, I think, with the motifs of Father Christmas being where he gets 8 reindeer from. Yeah, so that's kind of where that comes from. That's with the wall. The wall's not quite finished, which does allow Thor to walk in and out of Asgard. But he does have to cross several rivers in order to do so. And him and Loki kind of come and go through this unfinished wall, but it protects most of Asgard. So yeah, that's kind of the main structures here. You get lists of the different halls, but I think none of them are too particularly important to understanding the mythology. Besides that, there is a lot of themes of like transforming, Loki transforming into things, Odin transforming into things, a lot of gender being very fluid, Loki, and Odin both taking forms of women or female creatures at times, and there's even one of my favorite stories is the story of when Thor gets his hammer Mjolnir stolen from him. One morning Thor wakes up and he cannot find his mighty hammer Mjolnir. So he goes to the most likely culprit. He goes to Loki, the trickster, and he says, "Loki, you've stolen my hammer." And Loki goes, "No, I don't have your hammer. Someone else must have stolen it. Let me see if I can find your hammer for you." And so Loki goes to Freya, and says, "Hey, Freya, I need to borrow your falcon feather cloak that allows you to fly, so that I may fly to Jotunheim and see who has stolen Mjolnir." And Freya knows this is very important because only Thor with Mjolnir is strong enough to defend everyone from the Jotnar. So she allows Loki to borrow the cloak. And Loki takes the cloak and he turns and he flies over Jotunheim until he comes across a Jotun named Thrymir. And Thrymir admits to stealing Mjolnir, saying that he's hidden Mjolnir away and that they will never find that hammer again unless they give him, of course, Freya, the goddess of beauty, to be his bride. All the giants just, they want Freya. I mean, who doesn't want the most beautiful goddess to be their wife, I guess. And so Loki returns with the news to Thor, and so Thor has to approach Freya, saying, "Hey, Freya, how do you feel about marrying a giant?" And Freya says, no, that's not going to happen. No. The hammer is really important and stuff, but it's not. I'm not going to give up myself for that, And so they have to come up with a new plan, and they're thinking about it and what to do when Heimdall, the guard of the Bifrost Bridge, who hears everything, who hid his ear inside Yggdrasil, the world tree, so he can hear out over all the world and can see even the grass grow on far lands. He comes up with a plan and says, "Hey, why don't we just send Thor in place of Freya?" And they're like, "Oh yeah, that's a good idea." And so the Aesir, they grab Freya's bridal gown, and they put it on Thor, and they take Bringsgamen, the necklace of beauty from Freya, and they put it around Thor's neck, and they cover his face with a bridal veil. And Loki decides that he'll go with Thor, and he turns himself into a beautiful handmaiden to accompany him because he can. And then Thor and Loki then sail to Jotunheim, and it takes about like 9 days to get there. And when they get there, Thrymir is so excited to see his new bride that he runs directly up to Thor, and he lifts the bridal veil, only to see these two big red angry eyes staring back at him. And he jumps back in surprise, going, why does my bride have such big red angry eyes? And Loki goes, oh no, it's okay, it's fine. You see, what actually happened here is that Freya was so excited to marry you that she could not sleep for the whole 9 days it took to get here. So she's just very, very tired. And Thrymir goes, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Let's continue with the wedding ceremonies then. Let's start with the wedding feast. And so they start the wedding feast, and Thor does, what Thor does at feasts, and he ends up eating, 3 whole oxen. He eats 6 whole salmon, and he drinks 3 barrels of ale. And Thrymir is just looking at Thor doing this, going, that's not very ladylike. And Loki goes, oh, no, it's okay, it's fine. You see, what actually happened here was that Freya was so excited to marry you that she could not eat for the whole 9 days it took to get here. So she's just very incredibly hungry. And Thrymir goes, okay, yeah, no, I guess that makes sense, I suppose. So Thrymir decides, okay, let's continue with the wedding ceremony then. So they start the wedding ceremony, and in the Norse custom, you take a hammer and you place the hammer in a bride's lap in order to bless the marriage to be nice and fertile and fertile. And so Thrymir takes Mjolnir out of hiding, and he places it directly in Thor's lap. And so when he does so, Thor then takes Mjolnir and he pays the giants their dowry in split skulls and death, and that is how cross-dressing saved the world. And and it's one of those stories, like a lot of Norse stories, where gender is very fluid. It kind of subverts expectations of ultra manliness. This is kind of an example of Norse wit. Just dressing someone up and in disguise, and yeah, no, it's one of my favorite stories, and is a good example of a lot of expectations people have for Norse culture and society, and how this kind of flies in the face of that. To think of Thor as being the man's man, this ultra strong figure, and to have him be in a bridal gown, and to have them be okay with that, says a lot about the society, which we can really appreciate. I mean, they weren't as progressive with accepting of things as we are nowadays, but they were definitely a lot more than everybody else back then. And so in the spirit of that, even modern Scandinavians tend to be leaders in a lot of progressive ideas about gender and sexuality and equal rights for women and such. So yeah, no, I really like that a lot, and it's an important thing, and one of those kind of the ways that the old stories can tell great truths in modern times. But yeah, so we like that story, and that one comes from the Prose Edda, actually, instead of the Elder Edda. So that one was actually written with in Snorri's book instead of one that he compiled from earlier sources. But I'm sure they can make new dresses. They know dwarfs, but and for some reason, Thrymir never even noticed Thor's beard under that bridal veil, but too distracted by the eyes, I guess. Big, beautiful, red, angry eyes. Yeah, so that's kind of an introduction to Norse mythology there. So we've mentioned a couple of other important gods so far. So you have we brought Norther up earlier. So this is kind of, he's a Vanir god. Vanir gods being more peaceful gods that are not as associated with war as much as the Aesir seem to be. Freya being Freya actually takes like half of the those who die and would go to Valhall for herself, and Njordur is the father of Freya and her brother Freyr. These peaceful gods kind of, yeah. So looks like we might be needing a break. Yeah, we can stop the stream, and we could reconvene if you guys were interested in continuing that in like it's like 4:30 or 5 o'clock. Go on for another hour, or we can just call this a day and even come back at this next week. How are we feeling about that? Anybody not lurking in chat? Yeah. So maybe come back on Wednesday. Looks like Miss May is going to have to go to work now. Thank you for stopping by. I really appreciate it. Yeah. If Fridays tend to be busier, I could do Wednesdays at 2:30. You know, so maybe we'll reconvene on Wednesday, and then we can continue talking about. Yeah. Yeah, we did about 2.5 hours. Went a little bit long, I think. I think everybody's getting kind of tired, so we'll do about maybe an hour and a half, maybe on Wednesday at like 2:30. So like 2:30 to about 4, I think. Be about an hour and a half. Yeah. Thank you, Magic, for coming by. Yeah, and we'll just plan on that next Wednesday. Yeah, I've had a really great time. Thank you everyone for being here. Hope you have a good and weekend. I'll just